So AI may assist with these roles, but it can't replace the human judgment that underpins justice. And that justice is obviously something that I'm very involved in and very attached to pursuing.
We have to educate ourselves. And like you said, there's a lot of information out there. So it's a matter about finding the right information, educating ourselves. And of course, when in doubt, reach out to Leslie Lansman. And I'm sure she'll help us out, help our podcast listeners out, point us to the right source here. Is that something that they're worrying about? Is that something that are being acted upon? Is there anything to protect that content?
I might even suggest that it has to be opened up a little. It's not just publishers, but it is all of us. And thanks a lot for asking this question, because this is something that I would love everyone to know a little bit more about.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Publisherspeak podcast. I'm your host, Sowmya. Today, we are continuing our conversation with Leslie Lansman, Head of Permissions and Licensing at Springer Nature. If you caught part one, you already know Leslie has a gift for making the complex world of copyright feel approachable. In this second part, we go a little deeper. We talk about how AI is reshaping what it means to be an author, how copyright is adapting to a world of co-creation, and where publishers need to show up with clarity and care. Leslie brings both legal insight and creative thinking to the table. And I think you'll find part two of this conversation as thought-provoking as part one. Let's dive right in. Hey, thanks, Leslie, for joining us on the part two of the Publishers Speak podcast. Thanks once again, because I really felt there were a lot of topics that we couldn't get into within that podcast time, right? So I thought it would be great to have a little bit more of a deep dive. There's one thing that I wanted to pick up as my first question to you. You described copyright as fuzzy, and I think you also said it has probably a lot of gray areas. In today's age, where it's a lot around automation, instant sharing, do you think that fuzziness is it a strength or is it a liability? What are your thoughts on that?
I do think this question has been around for quite a long time, probably as long as copyright, which during my first podcast we went over has been here for a significant amount of our history. I think Mark Twain, he's said to have quipped in his notebook sometime around, I think, 1902, that only one thing is impossible for God, and that to find sense in any copyright law on the planet. So fuzziness is probably a good word. Copyright lives in those gray zones as it governs that which is most personal to a human being, our own original creativity. This seems very personally attached to who we are. So I think that fuzziness, our human capacity to hold simultaneous, nuanced, or potentially even contradictory thoughts, is a great strength that humans have and AI doesn't have. So as whether or not this could become a liability, probably not. But I do think these two systems, the human one with all of its shades of gray and the tech one with its on, off, black, white, they have some interoperability issues. When we try to feed into these binary systems, our fuzzy human dilemma, I do think things can go awry. This can include truly horrifying accounts, such as the multiple reports of AI encouraging self-harm, even to some of the absurd, saccharine, overly enthusiastic replies. I mean, just yesterday, I put a simple list into an AI system, and it gave me this overly enthusiastic response about how exciting and thought-provoking my request to alphabetize a list was. I mean, this is not true. So I do think that there is still some work to be done around what that actually will look like. But what we do know is what unregulated text looks like. And if there are none of those no regulations, if we don't allow for the fuzziness of humanity to be part of this system, we might repeat some of those mistakes that we saw with social media. And there's some truism out there that those who fail to learn from history are going to be doomed to repeat it. I think there's quite a lot of people who work in policy and AI right now who argue about what is it going to mean to win the AI race. And I think I agree with the people who say that the global AI race may not necessarily be won by the fastest adopter, by whoever becomes the most effective regulator. So I think it's interesting to see the tactics arguably being used by the two largest contenders to win this AI race, China and the US. In the US, we have a 30-page AI action plan, which is 3 plans, one about promoting the export of American AI, one about accelerating data center infrastructure, and one something about preventing the woke. China, in contrast, has 2 to 3 pages, very much centered on sharing technologies, working with other nations to establish governance processes, environmental rules, and guardrails, and in other ways, just trying to emerge as the global AI governance leader. And I would not underestimate what those efforts are, and the strategic difference is worth, I think, watching between these two territories. And so, in summation, to what you're asking, these issues of these two systems interoperating, the human one and the AI one, this is what will help us to get to effective regulation. Even if we look in my own field, the law, with its laws and statutes, which are widely available and published easily everywhere, after some form of legislative consensus, it's still full of ambiguity. Otherwise, we wouldn't have judges and academics and advocates and lawyers and all the people who work in our field. So AI may assist with these rules, but it can't replace the human judgment that underpins justice. And that justice is obviously something that I'm very involved in and very attached to pursuing. So ultimately, AI isn't a strategy. It's a powerful tool that can work well in the service of clearly defined goals. And it's up to all of us to think carefully as to where do we need that human nuance and where can AI help us with our own thinking. I mean, that's the real challenge and real opportunity of the moment, rather than just trying to throw out all the fuzziness or gray areas which really have kind of built up our uniqueness, our originality, and our individuality.
Certainly, I completely agree with that. Now, but as a copyright becomes, very complex to especially the non-lawyers. I mean, you are able to understand a 30-page, statute that got put out by US. Most lay people cannot understand the legal language. Now, how can and since we are in the publishing industry and we're talking about that, how can the publishing industry, say, play a more active role in demystifying what copyright means to authors and researchers, and what would doing that well look like?
hmm well, I do think if even God found copyright tricky, we can all give ourselves a break for finding some of the ways in which each individual territory articulates their copyright commitments challenging to understand. But complexity is not opacity. And there are some really great resources out there. And perhaps I can just share a few that I know of that I would recommend. So, a good place to look is trade organizations or collective management organizations. So, here in the UK, places such as the Publishers Licensing Service, Licensing Agency, Copyright Clearance Center in the US, Copyright Agency in Australia, industry and trade groups such as STM, authors associations, ALPS, all of these different organizations really do some great work tailored to their audience on resources and tools to help you understand rights, navigate rights, and learn how to potentially use them. Many of them will often also host webinars where more timely discussions can be had and more kind of current and up-to-date things. And then there's obviously, political action groups or action groups generally, such as the Creative Rights and AI Coalition. And of course, things like this podcast. I actually think the challenge is not that there isn't enough information out there to help the non-lawyer translate it all. I think the challenge is the sheer volume of information sometimes. With so many voices in this AI space, it can be really difficult to know what exactly is worth my time. I mean, my own hours. And I don't think there's any easy solution. I think a good rule of thumb is to try to read something that everyone's reading in your field and whatever it is that you're working on, and try to read something that fewer people are reading on, to try to challenge yourself to understand a different perspective. And always try to understand what perspective, whatever it is you are reading, comes from. Because I think when it comes particularly to copyright in AI, it is very opinionated out there right now. We don't have a lot of, laws really that have been really developed by it. So ultimately, sharing information, I think, means tailoring it to your audience. So really figuring out what it is you need from the information that you want to receive or participate in. So for some people, it may be more depth and nuance, and others, it might be more clarity or simplicity. And all of these options are available. So I would say look for them, figure it out what it is you need, and don't be afraid to be skeptical, particularly around copyright information. I sometimes read the headlines and I'm going, I don't think these people are looking at the same news I am, particularly when it comes to some of the recent legal decisions. But for all of those doing all this great work in this space, demystifying rights isn't just about simplifying language. It's also about building trust, offering clarity in the entire rights chain, and making sure that each creator does feel supported and not sidelined in this entire conversation.
I think that's a very, very interesting point that you make there. We have to educate ourselves. And like you said, there's a lot of information out there. So it's a matter about finding the right information, educating ourselves. And of course, when in doubt, reach out to Leslie Lansman.
And I'm sure she'll help us out, help our podcast listeners out, point us to the right
Source here. But there's one topic, one question that I find a little baffling. Because when we talk about copyright, and you spoke about this in the part one of our podcast, where you said any human creation is essentially copyrighted, right? It could be your children's doodles, that's copyright. But in today's day and age, where AI is used at every stage of content creation, right? So what does copyright really look like? Where is that original human thought that comes in, or human creation that comes in? And AI is also growing in its capabilities, right? It's able to do a lot more today than it was probably a year ago. So what is that? What distinction? Where is that distinction now between what is copyrightable? What is that original human thought?
Yeah, obviously, this is a very gray area because we are dealing with copyright. But let's say you make a prompt with AI, say, I don't know, purple perky peaches, and you just pop that into some AI, you get a picture out, and you put this on your social media. How would you feel if somebody then used that picture for the cover of their book? Would it make a difference if instead of just putting in purple perky peaches into your prompt, you had written a poem about peaches and their eternally optimistic spirit, and you decided to then, after hours of fine tuning with an AI engine and then using Photoshop, to then use this as some type of social media image, and then someone else used it? Would you feel any different between those two different types of activities? I mean, these are the types of questions that copyright does answer. This is where fuzziness is helpful. How do we decide a few bricks in a construction site are just a mess, but a few bricks in a museum, now this is art, and we must go and see it and appreciate this? And these are the fun types of philosophical exercises that copyright tends to lend itself to, and the types of questions central to how we define authorship. So I think that line will still exist. If we can see that creative human element involved, most likely some type of copyright will be found. I also think that there's going to be new types of rights that we will end up developing, things that protect things like personality, things that have a difficult time fitting into the actual core copyright protected works that we currently understand. But beyond those types of fundamental questions is where is the line between something that is so trivial, so mundane, whatever it is, has no creativity, that copyright doesn't touch it, and the bricks in the museum that potentially are worth millions and millions now because some artists put their name to it. I don't know if that's as important as enforcement. And what I think it really does matter is enforcement. There's no, I think as we talked about this last time, there's no copyright police force, and the tendencies reported on for AI systems to self-preserve, including these systems masking their identity, backing themselves up, extending their own lifetime, finding back doors to copy themselves in open source software, or downright, employee extortion. There's lots of questions on how do we really enforce the rights that we do have in a space where we have a machine that seems to be going already within a few years to quite some extremes to do things that perhaps we wouldn't necessarily control or govern that system to do. And these features of self-preservation, they're not particular to one AI system, but they are part of AI itself. We are not going to get rid of this, just as we're not going to get rid of the hallucinations. So this is where regulators have a job to intervene. And it really is fantastic to see some of the innovations being explored in different parts of the world already, especially when it comes to truly harmful AI output, such as deepfakes. So Denmark, for example, there's been an amendment which introduced to provide individuals who are affected by deepfake content the ability to request its removal. Artists can demand compensation for unauthorized use of their image, and this right can extend past an artist's death. So there's lots of ideas going on there about what it truly means to protect the human and enforce those rights in the AI space. In a larger scale, the EU, while in the EU AI Act, there's no kind of outright ban on deepfakes, it does force companies to label AI generated content on their platforms through watermarks, etc., etc. And if AI companies in breach, it can face fines of up to 15 million or 3%, something like this, of its global turnover. So mechanisms exist. There is stuff out there to allow you to enforce those rights. But it is up to all of us, creators, users, regulators, to understand these regulations, understand how to use them, and of course, understand how to be compliant if we're ever using AI as ourselves. So I would say that the threshold of human authorship isn't disappearing, it is evolving. And I think we all have a a role in shaping that evolution.
I think you touched upon this the last time we spoke as well. That as the technology evolves, the copyright licensing models also have to evolve. I mean, there's also those have to go in, and how do you enforce the copyright protection, etc. Also needs to evolve as you kind of like move along in in these directions. But do you think there is a risk that overly restrictive licensing, for instance, could stifle innovation? And is there a line between, say, protection and possibility? Because I think we are at an age where there's a lot of new innovation that's coming out. And is there a risk that we can go overboard with this whole protectionism? And
Well, in my opinion, of course, the answer is going to be no. There's always a risk that anyone could go too extreme into any particular thing that a human being does. But in my opinion, the function of copyright is to stimulate innovation. That is its purpose. All this means is that it allows people to come together and figure out ways of working and cooperating with each other. This is where innovation flourishes. A license is just saying two people or more than two people have decided amongst themselves how they want to go about business. And I think that when humans are empowered to do that, that is when innovation really flourishes and when we can make true, real advancement, in whatever it is we're trying to progress on. So licensing just doesn't fall down from us from the sky, just created by humans. And so therefore, I think it really is part of that human puzzle. However, there are people out there who kind of try to say that over restrictive licensing could be punitive to AI models. This was the big argument in the recent Anthropic case in the US, where they were trying to say that the case couldn't go ahead because if they happened to lose, they would be thrown out of business. And how terrible would this be? The judge did not find this argument compelling. But the argument that requiring vested parties to agree on how resources should be utilized between their respective industries, they argue that that's a barrier is hard to understand. If big tech wants free open access to everyone's intellectual property, are they going to be prepared to give us free and open access to all of their intellectual property? I mean, this seems unlikely. Copyright has had lots of historic issues with going too far. I'm not saying it's never happened. Contracts of adhesion, overly restrictive agreements, particularly in the music business. This was a real area of concern. And copyright did counterbalance itself. It does have a way historically of fixing these types of imbalances with things like exceptions, limitations, defenses, bestseller rights, visual artists resale rights, rights to accommodate accessibility, etc., etc. So it is likely that as copyright has always developed, in the future there will also be perhaps some of these escape valves to ensure that certain things that we want to ensure, continue to be done with creative works, are done. But this is a long way in the future, I would say. And right now, we do have people like the Trumps of the world who seem to be weighing in on the logistical capabilities of big tech, saying things like it's impossible for them to license, it's just too difficult. So surely they can just get a pass on whatever it is that big tech wants to do. We can call it all fair use and done and dusted. We don't need to worry about this anymore. And I would really question this. They are spending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in developing and deploying AI. We are trusting these systems with things that are perhaps way more relevant in terms of crucial security. Things like our actual, security and defense departments, things like this, um, healthcare, taxes, things that really do kind of matter. So surely if they can be trusted with those types of things, they must be able to come up with a way to license. I mean, if they can pay for electricity, they surely should be able to pay for the other essential resource that AI needs, which is human created content. So I find these arguments, it's a little bit difficult to swallow, perhaps might be the right word. However, despite all of that, which I think is another very human thing, we have people like the Trumps of the world who are saying these things about the logistical deficiencies of the tech firms. However, we also have the US government coming out with its action plan. It doesn't say anything about changing copyright law. Similarly, in Australia, we had recently the Productivity Commission come out saying Australia needs the new text and data mining exception in order to make AI work. However, the Australian government has not agreed with that. It has said that they have no plans to change the current copyright regime in Australia. So I think it is natural because we are humans and we have lots of different opinions that even in governments there would be these different voices and different people arguing for what they think is going to be the magic thing that helps us. And from my point of view, I just have a lot of skepticism that the real problem is copyright. I don't think that's true.
Yep. 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 That's an interesting point that you make there. Now I'm bringing the conversation back to publishing and to publishers, right? Now, do you see any emerging standards or technologies that could help publishers protect their content in an AI training environment? Because I think that's something that a lot of publishers worry about today. What if my content is actually already being mined by these LLMs? What can publishers do in this sort of an environment? Is that something that they're worrying about? Is that something that are being acted upon? Is there anything to protect that content?
I might even suggest that it has to be opened up a little. It's not just publishers, but it is all of us. And thanks a lot for asking this question because this is something that I would love everyone to know a little bit more about because whether or not it's your own holiday photos on social media or a publisher's entire catalog, every single creator deserves clarity on how their work is treated in AI environments. And there are some promising solutions and standards emerging. There are things like the TDM or Text and Data Mining Rights Reservation Protocol available on the STM website. There are specific organizations such as NISO or the National Information and Standards Organizations who are actively developing standards and best practices related to AI and information management, including things like ethical implications, transparency, responsible use of AI content creation, discovery, etc. Here in the EU, we've awarded a study to assess the feasibility of a central registry of text and data mining opt-outs expressed by rights holders, kind of like a central area where people could go to understand the rights over content. And then on the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the International Standard Content Code, ISCC, who's working on more soft-bound or sticky rights metadata tool that would allow rights identification as content moves from platform to platform. So I think there is a lot happening, but as with all technological shifts, I do think enforcement and adoption of these tools may lag behind innovation. If I think back to the early days of email, most of us had one password and it was password, or perhaps if you're fancy, password 123. Now we have authenticity checks, security alerts, all the background stuff that the tech companies do behind we don't even see to try to secure and protect this content. We live in a much more protected world than we did when all of our passwords the same, if we even had one. So rights, metadata, and protection tools will likely follow this kind of path, a bit slow to start, but eventually they should be robust and comprehensive. And that is why I think right now, the soft power of licenses, which can be understood as a technological protection measure, and they do explain how the content can be used. Things like end user license agreements, direct licensing, whatever it may be, This can help set expectations and give creators a way to assert control, even if technical enforcement is near imperfect. And there are lots of questions out there as to whether or not tech companies ever listen to this. This is one of the things I get a lot. If I spend all this time learning about how to best do this, I have all my metadata up, is it going to matter because is anyone in the tech industry ever going to listen? I think this is a difficult question to answer. As I was going back to sharing news recently, there was a story, and either Meta whistleblowers released a website allegedly used to train Meta models, many of which had robots text exclusions, or that list was bogus, which is what Meta says. So one of these two things is true, and it's very difficult because there is not a lot of transparency on the tech sector as to exactly what has gone on into these systems to understand whether or not those things will really be adhered to. And that's why it's interesting to see in the EU, we have the EU AI Code of Practice, which most tech companies have signed up to. It's a voluntary code, but notably absent are Meta and Apple. Does this mean that they're gearing up to challenge the legitimacy of the code? I don't know. I mean, curiosity is helpful here. And even if you feel as if, it's not working all the time, whatever tactic you might pursue, I think it's important to try to continue to work with these tools and continue to be apprised of their how they progress.
Right, very true. I think I like what you mentioned earlier, that is technology is a little bit like a black or white, while human creativity is gray. And I think this is when these two come together is probably where we see a lot of challenges. Kind of figure out how these two can actually play together. But do you see harmony in these two coming together? What are some examples that give you hope where there's gray shades with black and white can come together and produce something that's fantastic?
So I think you asked if I've seen any examples that might have given me personal hope. And I actually quite did. I recently saw Karen Ronde, and I apologize, I have mispronounced her name, who is the CEO of the Danish press publications, give a speech at the PLS conference here in London. And she gave me tremendous hope. And I highly suggest anyone to listen to the recording, which is available on the PLS website. But she, on behalf of about 99% of the Danish news industry, has really challenged big tech dominance. She's led high profile actions, including legal threats against OpenAI to protect creators' rights. The sheer scale, wealth, and organizational power that tech industries possess can feel overwhelming. But history is full of examples of smaller nations or individuals, and yes, even sometimes lawyers standing up to those Goliaths and winning. And so I do celebrate all of the Karen Ronses who work proactively to achieve that sustainable future between AI and the human, allowing for all of that human fuzziness to continue to flourish, and also promoting innovation in areas where AI excels. And then the other cause for my optimism really would be the entire general public. It has been quite amazing in my field, where no one, I think, has really ever thought too much about copyright, to see how much the public does kind of feel as if they understand the inherent imbalance that is now kind of being proposed by the tech industry in this system. I think people kind of resonate with the unfairness of one industry being expected to hand over its entire value to another just to make them more successful, be able to do what it is that they want to do. So to every single person out there who may have taken part in a letter writing campaign, written to their representative, or even just asked questions when they are going about their daily lives or in their businesses, all of those voices really matter. And so I would give a big thank you to all of those people as well. And I think that's why I think all humans and all of our fuzziness still have a chance.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that's coming up in our future. Very exciting. We have to sit and watch how things play out. Thank you so much, Leslie, for joining us on the Publishers Speak podcast. And as always, I walk away, learning a lot more about copyright, about a lot of the the stuff that goes on behind creativity, rights, and about content. And there's so much that I can take away from you. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. It was great to have a chat, as always.
That's it for part 2 of my conversation with Leslie Lansman. I really appreciate her clarity, her candor, and the way she connects concepts to the real world that we're all navigating right now. If you found this conversation helpful or if it gave you something to think about, feel free to share it with a colleague. As always, thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with more.